In a decision by two high-profile owners of a Tim Hortons franchise in Cobourg, Ontario, sparked a furious online backlash today, all apparently connected to the province's minimum wage hike to $14 an hour. Ron Joyce Jr. and Jerry Lynn Horton Joyce, the son and daughter of the men who built the chain, told employees they will no longer receive paid breaks and will see cuts to their benefits. The details are in a letter obtained by CBC News. They say the changes are directly tied to the province's minimum wage increase. Breaks will no longer be paid, and that means an 8-hour shift will be 7.5 hours of pay. The workers will pay between 50 and 75% of the cost of their benefits. Non-union employees in Ontario are covered by the Employment Standard Act, and employers don't have to pay for meal breaks. In a statement, Tim Hortons said almost all of our restaurants in Canada are independently owned and operated by small business owners who are responsible for handling all employment matters, including all policies for benefits and wages for their restaurants. The owners at the Cobourg location did suggest that these changes may be temporary. Changes to minimum wage has other business owners talking as well. The owners at the Cobourg location did suggest that these changes may be temporary. So let's take a look at what some of those other owners are saying. They say that it's about the math, that an extra $2.40 an hour means, and boosting the minimum wage to $14, almost $5,000 a year extra before taxes for Ontario's neediest full-time workers. But that money obviously has to come from somewhere. As Olivia Stefanovich learned, bosses say it's a blow to their bottom line.
Finishing touches, and this cherry pie is ready for the oven. Employees at this bakery make dozens of desserts each day, but no matter how many line up for a taste, owner Wanda Beaver says she faces some tough decisions.
Obviously, everybody's going to have to get an increase in their wages, and I've calculated it's probably about $50,000 a year for the first year in off the bottom line.
Around the corner, this butcher shop has cut employee hours. In fact, more than half of small business owners surveyed by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business said they raised prices and reduced shifts in anticipation of the two-step wage increase. $14 now and up to $15 by next year.
Premier Wynne is doing this in a mere 15 months. So the issue is the speed and the magnitude. It's like a tsunami for small businesses in Ontario.
There's been a lot of dire predictions about the sky is going to fall. It's going to be catastrophic. I mean, here we are on day 3. The sky's still upright.
Halpin says paying people $14 an hour will put them above the poverty line.
When you put your labor out there, when you work, that you should be earn a decent wage and be able to support your family, your children, put food on their plate, pay your rent.
That helped motivate Ivan Geddes to mark up menu items and set his minimum wage to $16 in November.
Some of the lower paid employees were coming and asking for advances on their check for things like paying rent, groceries, whatever else. And it was heartbreaking to see that I, as an owner, was living relatively comfortably, but my staff weren't. So this increase is going to help a lot.
That's the kind of thinking he hopes other employers will embrace. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News, Toronto.
So how does Ontario's $14 minimum wage stack up to the rest of the country? Alberta's rate is slightly lower at the moment, but it will be the first province to reach $15. That's later this year. At the opposite end of the scale, Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia. Both are below $11 an hour.
For many of you, it's the first day back to work after the holidays. For those of you earning minimum wage in Ontario, you're starting the new year with a bump in pay. Not everyone stands to benefit from the new standards, though. As of yesterday, minimum wage in Ontario is $14 an hour. That's a 20% jump from $11.60 an hour. Ontario now has the highest minimum wage in Canada, but Alberta leapfrogs ahead on October 1st when its minimum wage goes to $15. $15 an hour. Ontario catches up to that at the start of 2019. Some economists say this is all great news for the economy. Others expect it will translate into higher prices for all of us, as well as jobs being cut. The Bank of Canada estimates the result could be as many as 136,000 job losses by 2019. It predicts low-wage earners would be hit the hardest. For more on this, let's bring in Brett House. He's Vice President and Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank. So now, Brett, this estimate of what the Bank of Canada is saying goes anywhere from 30 to 136,000. Big difference there. What could make it better or worse?
Well, their central projection is about a $60,000 job loss per year. And, that actually is on the low side of a lot of competing studies. And so that's some good news here. That gets compensated for by the increase in wages. And so overall, it implies that labor income in Canada would be going up. But consumption would probably come slightly down in aggregate because that would be offset by the fact that inflation would be raised slightly, and the Bank of Canada may then have to raise interest rates a bit, which would reduce the total disposable income for households.
Right. I mean, the logic behind all of this is that a lot of small business owners, and we've been hearing from them today on the news network, are saying, $15 an hour, that's going to really play havoc with the economics of my business. I'm going to have to lay off staff. But then the flip side of that is everyone says, well, wait a minute. More money in the pockets of your average person is more spending is good for business.
Right. And that's what's nice about this study that came out from the Bank of Canada today, because it puts all the minimum wage increases planned in the 9 of 10 provinces that have announced plans for pushing up minimum wages into a comprehensive model of the Canadian economy. And so rather than hand-waving about will it be good or bad for the reasons you mentioned, it actually puts all of that into one framework and says the net result would probably be a 1/10 of a point cut in GDP growth, a 1/10 of a point increase in inflation, neither of which are substantial, and as we just talked about, that 60,000 job hit. But that job hit could be compensated by other types of jobs coming into the economy. And it doesn't speculate about that effect, but it's not a zero-sum game where those jobs are gone and they'll never be replaced. Those automations or other productivity enhancing moves that get made by business to compensate for a higher minimum wage also kick off demand for other skills in the economy too.
Now, there have been other groups that have done these kind of estimates looking at minimum wage, and depending on their politics have said this is good news, this is bad news. How significant is it when the Bank of Canada weighs in on this?
Well, I think it's really significant because it shows us how the Bank of Canada will be thinking about the effects of these minimum wage increases in terms of its forward path on interest rates. It also shows us how they think about the integration of those wages into general economic activity across the economy. And what it's saying is that it doesn't see dire consequences coming from the minimum wage increases. And I think, in a broader context, we do need to think about these in terms of the last 15 years or so of economic history in Canada, where if you own shares in companies or if you owned a house or any real estate, you've done really well. In fact, particularly from the financial crisis to the present, the recovery has mainly benefited you. If you rely on wages only for your source of income, you haven't had a real wage increase in any substantial way over the last 10 to 15 years or so. So I see this as not just an economic question, but a political and social stability question, where raising wages for people on a minimum wage is really essential to keeping everyone bought into the economic model that is Canada.
Right. I mean, you say not dire consequences from this. And of course, you're talking about a 0.1% in GDP, a point this, point that, very small. But for 136,000 people, potentially, it's pretty serious.
Right. Well, there are always some margins of error around any number a model puts out.
Right.
And the thing to keep in mind is that the central projection is about half of that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here, Brett.
Thank you.
Brett House is the Vice President and Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank.
Just 3 days into the province's mandatory minimum wage hike to $14 an hour, and some small businesses and employees are already feeling the impact. Some companies say the wage increase will cost them tens of thousands of dollars, and employees may lose hours and paid perks. This as the Bank of Canada warns of job losses. Stephanie Skandaris has been looking into this today. And Stephanie, let's start with the Bank of Canada. What is it that they're saying?
Well, this new report from the Bank of Canada says there could be 60,000 fewer jobs across the country by the end of next year because of this series of wage hikes in several provinces. Now, this squares with what some economists have argued, that these increases are just too high, too fast for many businesses to shoulder. Now, CBC News spoke to some small business owners who say that even if they support a more livable wage, it comes with a very real cost.
My favorite pie.
Wanda Beaver runs a popular bakery in Kensington Market. She says the provincial government's wage hike creates a domino effect for her employees that already make more than the minimum.
Obviously, everybody's going to have to get an increase in their wages, and I've calculated it's probably about $50,000 a year for the first year in off the bottom line. And people go, well, you just take it off your own salary. Well, sorry, in the food business, $50,000 is a big chunk of change.
In order to afford it, she's raising the price of a pie by up to 10%. And she's not the only one making changes, like this meat shop, trimming its hours to cover the higher costs. And this Tim Hortons in Cobourg sent a letter to employees telling them some paid perks are gone, like paid breaks and part of the benefits the franchise offered. These repercussions and more were revealed in a survey last month by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business.
50% told us that they are going to reduce or eliminate plans to hire young people. So that first opportunity of a job for a young person in the workplace will be a lot more difficult.
This labor lawyer says businesses need to find the money somewhere, so taking away additional perks is not illegal.
These are things that are within the employer's prerogative to do because they're relatively small in terms of scope and scale. And so these are precisely the type of things that I think employees should unfortunately expect.
I think those small business owners should wait it out, should understand that there was tax breaks being offered by the government. They'll take advantage of those and recognize there's a benefit when they produce a living wage for the people that work for them.
Some small business owners are in favor of the minimum wage increase.
People deserve these wages.
Ivan Ged says he wanted to increase wages at his Ottawa restaurant even before it was mandatory.
If we were to have done it on our own previously, we may have found that we were positioning ourselves outside of our direct competition and thereby hindering our bottom line.
Now, even Ivan Getz, the restaurant owner you just saw there, who supports the wage increase, says he had to raise his menu prices to afford it. That labor lawyer, Jason Beho, told us to expect more changes like that. And that's because this isn't the last increase we'll see. The minimum wage is expected to go up again in Ontario. That'll be $15 a year, and that's a year from now.
All right. Thanks for this, Stephanie.
You're welcome.
You've been watching a story out of Ontario that's gotten the Premier herself very upset.
Absolutely. Things can really heat up, Andrew, when good intentions don't land as planned.
Truly believe Kathleen Wynne is doing a great thing by increasing our minimum wage, but I feel that they didn't completely think it through.
So imagine if you got a big raise, nearly 18%, only to find out you will be taking home less money. The minimum hourly wage in Ontario just rose to $14. Some bosses responded by cutting hours, paid benefits, and other perks. Today, the Premier herself came out swinging against such moves. But as Jacqueline Hansen tells us, this is a complex issue, and it's tough to say who has won and who has lost.
This small-town coffee shop is now a poster child for the unintended consequences of Ontario's minimum wage hike. Employees received this letter from the store's owners saying that due to the wage increases and the lack of assistance and financial help from our head office and from the government, breaks will no longer be paid, and long-term employees will now be required to pay half the cost of their benefits.
I was shocked because I figured maybe we had some perks of being senior staff there, that we would be able to keep our benefits.
This Tim Hortons employee agreed to speak to CBC News on condition of anonymity, factoring in fewer paid hours and the cost of covering part of their benefits. The employee estimates that every 2 weeks, they'll take home $50 less.
I thought I was getting ahead, and this legislation was put there to help the minimum wage employees make a little more money, and we're losing more than what we're gaining.
A group representing some franchisees says it hoped to raise menu prices to help offset the higher labor costs. But it says while other competitors have received concessions from their franchisors, unfortunately, our chain has not. Many of our store owners are left no alternative but to implement cost-saving measures in order to survive. That's not how Ontario's premier sees it.
I think it is bullying. I think it's taking it out on people who really who haven't got the ability to fight back, and I think it is vindictive.
But Tim Hortons is just one flashpoint in the minimum wage debate.
Restaurants in Ontario run on the thinnest margins in the country. We're going to see a reduction in service hours. We're going to see layoffs, unfortunately, and unfortunately we're going to have costs passed on to the consumers.
That seems to be the bottom line. Someone has to shoulder the cost of that big raise. Customers, owners, or workers. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Cobourg, Ontario.
Now, in the minimum wage conversation this country is having, there's a constant push and pull between the costs and benefits to workers and their bosses. The math is on a lot of minds. So we reached out to the group that represents more than 500 Tim Hortons franchisees. To them, the $2.40 hourly increase is actually a lot more than that. Here's how they break it down. Factor in additional costs, including CPP, EI, and training, and it's actually $3.35 extra an hour. After a year's worth of serving donuts and coffees, that means an added cost to the franchisee of $7,000 per full-time employee. Still with us? Given an average of 35 employees per franchise, that's $243,000 a year. The hit to their bottom lines from this minimum wage increase in Ontario, anywhere between 4% and 7%.
Okay, thanks, Karen.
Stay warm.
A dispute over the province's new minimum wage boiling over today as employees of 6 other Tim Hortons outlets revealed they're losing some compensation and benefits. We told you last night about that franchise in Cobourg owned by the heirs of the Tim Hortons chain that did the same thing. Our Greg Ross has been talking to an employee and customers. Greg, these employees say, though, even though their wages may be going up, they're still losing out here big time.
That's right, Shannon. January 1st was supposed to be a very important day for employees across the province making minimum wage. That's the day they were supposed to get a big raise with minimum wage going up to $14. Well, as it turns out, many employees at Tim Hortons franchises across the province, they're finding out that that raise is not going to be anywhere near as big as they were hoping.
Another day and another revelation that a Tim Hortons franchise owner is taking benefits away from employees.
Do you think that's fair?
No, I don't.
This woman works at one of 6 Tim Hortons in the Durham region, all with the same owner. She says this notice was posted last month at her store. It says, as of January 1st, 2018, we will no longer be able to provide the benefit of paid breaks. This woman says she was looking forward to getting a big raise in the new year, but because of this, it's going to be much smaller than expected.
Well, it's half an hour a day off my shift. So I'm a full-time employee, so it works out to close to $2,000 annually out of my pocket.
This comes on the heels of a CBC story yesterday that revealed employees at a Tim Hortons in Cobourg, Ontario, were losing their paid breaks and other paid benefits. The owners are Ron Joyce Jr. and Jerry Lynn Horton Joyce, the son and daughter of the chain's co-founders. That had the premier lashing out.
I think that asking workers to sign a pledge, agreeing to unpaid breaks, or agreeing to less pay than the actual hours that they're working, that's not fair, but it's also not decent. So, to be blunt, I think it's the act of a bully. And if Mr. Joyce wants to pick a fight, I would say to him, pick that fight with me and not the people who are working at the pickup window or at the service counter of the stores. You know?
Customers we talked to outside of this Oshawa Tim Hortons, where employees are losing their paid breaks, agreed with the Premier.
Wow. You know what? The profit that Tim Hortons makes, they can afford the breaks, they can afford the benefits, without a doubt.
That's total bogus. That's not right. People need a living wage. It's not a lot of money.
The owner of these 6 Durham Region Tim Hortons outlets would not comment when we phoned him today. The employee we spoke with feels Tim Hortons is reneging on its promises it made when she was hired.
What bothers me is the contract of employment that they have no intention of complying with.
And of course, we've concealed the identity of that woman. It's because she's fearful that there could be repercussions for speaking out about this. She says that many employees at these Tim Hortons franchises feel helpless to do anything about this, but she says she's not ruling out the possibility of going to the Labor Board and seeing if there is anything that she can do.
Thanks so much, Greg.
The fight for a $15 minimum wage goes back years in several U.S. cities, New York, Seattle, San Francisco, just to name a few. But it's only recently gained enough momentum in Canada to become policy. First in Alberta, where that bump takes effect next year. And then, as we heard today, Ontario's plan is for the year after that. We want to talk more now about the impact all those planned labor changes could have on workers and businesses. Armin Yalnizyan is a public economist. Carl Baldoff is with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, both here to talk about it. So, Armin, let me start with you. What especially do you like about what you heard today, assuming you like it?
Oh, I think it's a long overdue suite of packages that actually bring back respect for workers' abilities as well as time. And I think it'll build the economy from the bottom up, which is something we've been waiting for a long time. I think it's actually an inclusive growth strategy. So I'm loving it.
Okay, so build the economy is not what you often hear from businesses in reaction to an increase in the minimum wage, Carl. Is there something about this you don't like in particular?
Well, we all deserve evidence-based reform, and our message to the government of Ontario is, of course, we all want to share in prosperity, but if you're going to proceed with such dramatic changes, we need to do so in a way that is evidence-based. And so although this review has taken 2 years, at no point have they conducted a cost-benefit analysis to fully understand what will be the impact of these changes on the economy broadly. And we're a bit concerned that there will be broadly negative changes as a result of the reforms announced today.
Such as?
Well, a number of businesses have indicated to us that they're going to have to increase prices on everyday goods to consumers. Other businesses have said they're going to have to scale back on the number of workers that they have. And still other businesses, especially small businesses, have said that they're going to have to close up shop completely because after a number of new costs, such as the CPP enhancement, such as cap and trade, such as rising electricity prices, they're at the end and they cannot take any more new costs.
Okay, so Armin, job losses, businesses moving, businesses shutting down. What's the counter to that?
Well, definitely there will be job losses. Definitely businesses will have to shut down. There's always businesses operating at the margin where any little thing will tip them over. Mm-hmm. But what will happen is that the people that are getting paid are going to actually be able to spend more money. And that is going to actually increase business for some businesses. It's going to build the economy from the bottom up because it's not businesses that create jobs, it's customers. And when customers have more money to spend, they are able to, especially minimum wage workers are able to spend more money in the economy because they're not being squeezed with housing costs. There's more disposable income to spend.
On the point of evidence-based reform, it was the Premier's own advisory panel on minimum wages 3 years ago that said for every 10% increase in minimum wage, youth unemployment, it goes up 6%. So this is the real challenge that we have right now. There are a lot of unintended consequences, and the government has not done the proper work to fully understand what that will mean. And that also means that they haven't prepared for the offsets that will be needed to help businesses transition into this new reality.
I don't think we need any offsets for what's about to happen because the new reality is not a 20th century reality. It's a 21st century reality where our young people are working and not seeing any increases. So this $15 an hour minimum wage is not a working wage, as our banner tells us. It's a living wage. It helps people actually do more in life than just work to scramble to try and make ends meet. And I think the idea that businesses have to be offset for everything that happens, I don't understand why it is that workers don't need to be offset for every time a Tim Hortons decides to raise the price of coffee without raising the price of wages.
I mean, doesn't it speak to a business model that may not be working if you are, as Armin said, sort of right on the margins, that this is the thing that tips the scale and shuts your business down, that maybe your business cannot operate in this economy?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges that we're looking at right now, and chief among them is the impending renegotiation of NAFTA. So an economy like Ontario is extremely exposed already. So you have that on the one hand. On the other hand, you have new costs. And so there are so many vulnerabilities that exist in our society. We are encouraging as a business community to say, of course, a third week of vacation, that's not going to kill us. But all of these changes happening without a foundation of a good knowledge about what the economic impact will be, that's frankly irresponsible. We deserve evidence-based decision-making.
What is irresponsible, in my view, Diana, is that we haven't had the changes that should have been happening over the last 20 or 30 years. The Premier herself said we haven't done a proper review of labor laws for over 2 decades. And so consequently, some of the changes that should have been happening incrementally to keep pace with things like the new normal of being temporary jobs for young people and no control over your working hours and sometimes your working conditions, and more bosses actually violating laws, knowing that they can get away with it because they're not enforced.
But
these should have been happening before.
So then is this too much too fast?
Well, I guess there's plenty of opportunity for us to debate all of that because there will be an election coming up fairly shortly. So if you don't like it, it'll be interesting to see what other parties actually offer as well. But I think the bigger story here is what are we going to do to catch up to 21st century realities? If you just keep saying no to changes that actually help workers, you're not improving the economy.
One of the pieces that was announced today was the call for more enforcement. And broadly, I think the employer community, more than anyone, acknowledges that bad apple employers actually make life more difficult for those employers that follow the rules.
Yeah.
And so we don't have any issue with that. But what we do have an issue with is the lack of education. So I far too often will chat with small businesses in small towns who employ themselves, their spouse, and their neighbor, and they want to do right. But the education is so convoluted for these individuals who have taken it upon themselves to become entrepreneurs. They don't understand what their obligations are. So increasing enforcement is one thing, but what also has to happen is increase education of regulations that exist.
I couldn't agree more, actually, with this, because what we have noticed in the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where I used to work, and living wage campaigns, is when you talk to employers about what a living wage can mean for their workers and for the local economy, they're on board. So I think you're right that there's a few bad apples that do need to be pinned in because you want to discourage bad behavior. You don't want to keep turning a blind eye to it. But it's also a process of actually improving everybody's economy.
But does this, even the headline coverage of this today, discourage businesses from hiring, make them look at their numbers and go, well, we're just going to stick with the numbers we have here in terms of employees?
The answer is absolutely yes. Well, we're looking at across the province, companies are saying to us they cannot make it work anymore. There was an example during this review of 2 major franchises, one from the United States, one from Alberta, came to us and said, we're thinking about opening up in Ontario, but we're not going to do so until this review concludes because we're concerned about what the new costs will be. That's the reality in Ontario right now. We're seeing challenges that exist with no commitment by government to tackle them. It's going to lead to increased job losses.
But who do you give priority to in that circumstance? To the business or to the workers?
I actually think there's a win-win solution here by raising wages, because you don't want to have an economy in the 21st century that is based on low wages. You want to have an economy that's based on productivity enhancements. If they let go of some workers, that means they will become more productive. The ones that actually disappear may be so marginal that that's not a net loss for the economy if other companies become stronger, create better jobs with more skills. And in fact, what you're doing is for the masses of workers that do function at less than $15 an hour, which by the way is 30% of our economy. We've been driving the economy on a low wage basis for far too long. We want more productivity, and if raising wages does it, that will actually be good for everybody.
We've got about 30 seconds left, so why don't you take us to the end?
I think it's important to remember, too, that we're not just talking about businesses. One of the largest employers of part-time and contract workers in this province is the province of Ontario. So there's been no discussion about what these impacts will have on the provincial treasury. And as taxpayers, Once again, in the notion of evidence-based reform, we need to understand what it will cost us.
Carl, Armin, thanks so much for this.
Thank you.
Right, let's just take that
But
point.
there is a question of evidence here, and I think we need to look at the evidence. I have been an economist for long enough to know what those textbooks say. But it's very interesting that there's a difference between the theoretical expectation about the impact of the minimum wage and the empirical evidence. In 1982, after a long and exhaustive study conducted by the congressionally mandated Minimum Wage Study Commission, the conclusion was that the minimum wage is not the primary factor responsible for black teenage
absolutely wrong.
All
No,
right, but
that was the conclusion of the commissioners. Now, if you read through the other 7 volumes of the reports of the professional studies in there, most of those economists that did the professional studies said that the minimum wage law has a devastating effect on teenagers. And furthermore, they recommended sub-minimum wage.
All right, let's specifically...
But I just don't want you to mislead the public by looking at volume 7, because that was the conclusion of the political figure.
But I want to give another statistic.
Dr. Anderson, let me just get you to respond to Dr. Williams' point about the business deterioration being a factor. Why his explanation of the business deterioration is very different from yours.
Well, what he's saying is that the minimum wage caused it all. That if there's any problem in the inner city, it was caused by the minimum wage, and clearly that is not correct.
But what about his position that the minimum wage did, in fact, eliminate the kinds of jobs that low-skilled young people would be after, like the ushers in the theater and so forth, and prevented other jobs?
Union, for example. I don't doubt that the minimum wage probably has had some effect on the number of jobs, but there are opportunities within existing law for employers to hire teenagers at lower than the minimum wage, and I'd give you 2 pieces of information on this. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act that is now in existence, an employer can hire a teenager at less than the minimum wage, but that program has been undersubscribed by private employers from the very time it was put on the law book. Secondly,
you mean they're not using it?
They're not using it. The point is that the law now that they're not using the exemptions available in law. Secondly,
the bureaucratic things that you have to do it. It makes it prohibitively expensive for somebody other than McDonald's, who hires many teenagers, to go through that process.
I'd like to give you another bit of evidence. Between 1977 and 1980, the Congress supported an act called the Youth Incentive Entitlement Program. Under that program, an employer in 17 designated communities throughout this country could hire disadvantaged teenagers at no cost. All the teenager had to do was to remain in school or to return to school for a part-time job during the school year or a full-time job during the summer. Now, under that program, a teenager was available to employers at no cost, yet less than 23% of all jobs available under that program to minority youth, and I'm talking here about 73,000 jobs, less than 23% of them were made available by the private sector.
So your point is what?
My point is that the minimum wage is not the primary factor responsible for the unemployment of black youth, and that is confirmed by studies I have conducted myself.
Well, what do you...
May I respond just to the question of the minimum wage? Because if you take the doctor's argument further, he uses this sweatshop example. I'm a little shocked and surprised, saying, what would the do-gooders do if they find out that the teenager or the minority or the old woman was not working for $1 an hour? All of the problems as to why teenagers and others, lack of skills, lack of productivity, has nothing to do with the minimum wage. It was designed by the Congress to put some type of a bottom as to what people should be able to get for goods and services. If the argument is that certain people don't reach that expectation of $3.35, it would seem to me that it would be in the interest of the country, certainly our poor and our black, to increase access through training programs to make certain that they would be productive. But I'm suggesting this, that if you eliminate it altogether and allow the $1 an hour to work, and it's silly to talk about this when over 11 million people are unemployed anyway, what is the difference between the good doctor suggestion and the slavery system where people who are in need of food and shelter are willing to pick cotton without any type of standards? Somebody has to do it, and it's not a farm. An argument because we do have illegals that come into the country doing just that, and we do have migrant laborers
I'm not even going to
doing
respond to
just
that because that's beside the point. But the point
migrant
is now,
laborers are laborers.
I think that there's something for all of us to see. Now, Dr. Anderson and I believe the congressman want to say that the minimum wage law has no effect or just insignificant effect on teenage unemployment. But let's anticipate what they're going to say with response to another question. You say, well, let's have a sub-minimum wage law for young people. Now, both these guys will respond that they're against the sub-minimum wage law because they'll give firms incentives to hire kids and fire the fathers. I'm quite sure that they're going to say that. But if the minimum wage law has no effect, see they want to have it on both sides. They want to have their cake and eat it too. First, they want to say it has no effect, and then we recommend a policy to deal with some of the effects of the minimum wage law. Then you're going to say, no, I'm against that because it will cause unemployment among older people. So which is it? Does the minimum wage law have an effect, or does it not?
I don't see.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Co-host today is Chris Rossini. He is also the editor of the RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Chris, welcome to the program today.
Great to be back with you, Dr. Paul. Thank you.
Good. You know, just recently, our friend, Future of Freedom Foundation, Jacob Hornberger, did a blog, and he reviewed the history of what was going on in Switzerland with dealing with the minimum wage. And he has some interesting new points about it. And we've talked about the minimum wage often. And I think most people who have an inkling about free markets understand how detrimental they are, and they actually hurt the people they're trying to help. Most people who are for the minimum wage are, you know, bleeding hearts, and they think, oh, if we could just raise the wages of the poor people, it would be everything good. And they put this full trust in the government. So they put a lot of dependency on the government to solve the problems of economics, and yet it's the government that creates them so much. But he did a neat review about this, and I actually learned some things about where the Swiss have stood on minimum wage laws. In this country, we take it for granted. First, if there's a federal government law that mandates minimum wage, hardly anybody thinks anything about it, but nobody asks the question, you know, at a presidential debate, well, you support minimum wage or don't you? Where does the government get this authority? It doesn't tell us in Article 1, Section 8 that Congress has the authority to regulate any wages, let alone the minimum wage. And also, it's the economic issue gets discussed now and then, but we seem to lose that argument all the time. But very rarely do we talk about the moral issue. By what right does government come in to regulate voluntary contracts? And we who are libertarians see voluntary contracts, both economic and social, as being the same. And just because one seems to be different, that you can regulate economic activity, but not morality and social conditions, that there's entirely difference. But they're all in the one. But I know, Chris, that you had a chance to take a look at Jacob's article, and I imagine you have a few comments to make about what this minimum wage law and controversy is all about.
Yes, I actually learned a few things too about Switzerland. It turns out that a few years ago, Switzerland had a national referendum that would make the nation's minimum wage $25 an hour. And that's $10 more than that's being proposed here. And a whopping 76% of the Swiss voted against the minimum wage of $25 an hour. Furthermore, Switzerland has no minimum wage. Now in America, unfortunately, most people, if there was no minimum wage, we're so hardwired to think that people would be, you know, dead in a ditch somewhere. And if they were working, they'd be working for pennies and eating grass. But amazingly, over in Switzerland, even though they don't have a minimum wage, and they defeated a proposal for a $25 minimum wage, they have amongst the highest paid people in the world. Now, one question I have for you, Dr. Paul, is if the minimum wage is such a great thing, why is Bernie Sanders so cheap? Why $15 an hour? Why not $50 an hour? I would venture to say that most people watching this show would be thrown out of work immediately, don't you think?
Well, we used to kid about that when they'd come to the House floor and they'd have a bill that's moved the minimum wage up to $8 an hour or $7 an hour. Well, why don't you make it 15? Well, there's a little bit of risk in that. Then they go and ask for 15 and they don't even get the point. But, you're right. They don't know, and how would they possibly? It's no better, they can't do any better job than the Fed does in picking what the interest rates should be. They don't know what the interest rate should be. The market should determine it, or you get into financial trouble. The same way with wages. If you want full employment, you have to have wages adjusting. You have to have people have an incentive to learn and move up the ladder. And if they're not distracted by welfare benefits, there are two black economists, Tom Sowell and Walter Williams, who have written extensively on how so many of these laws hurt poor black people. But they have shown before the minimum wage law, black unemployment was equal to white unemployment. And people, oh no, that's not possible because there's always been bigotry and all this stuff. And they say it's purely a racial thing. But now black unemployment is like 40%, and teenage unemployment is higher than ever. And even college graduates, they're underemployed or unemployed. So, and it's all this interference in the marketplace. And the price of labor is very important. We talk a lot about the price of money and interest rates, how important that is, but the price of labor is very important. And they say, oh yeah, that's why these business people, the price of labor goes up here, because of minimum wages and because of union wages and all, and they price themselves out of the market. So some businesses, due to regulations and taxes and labor, they go overseas and they say, oh, this is terrible. This is terrible. And then somebody else comes in and they say they're stealing jobs. Well, there's a lot of jobs available in this country. It's under training. It involves the public school system, because they're not training anybody to get a good job, but the system is designed, to get degrees, and they're graduating from college and they haven't even learned arithmetic. If you spend tens, if not $100,000 on a college degree and you can't get a job and you end up with a debt, there's something wrong with it. Government management of the economy, whether it's labor costs or monetary costs or the regulations that are supposed to make us safe and happy, all this stuff just doesn't work. So this was really neat to find this story that refutes so many of those myths out there about why it's necessary. And here's a country that doesn't even have minimum wage laws, and they're doing quite well. They're prosperous. No minimum wage laws, and they're probably the highest paid in all of Europe. This is very remarkable. It's even better than I would have predicted. I knew it would be better, but it turns out how useless legislation is to regulate. It's economic planning. That's what communism and socialism and Nazism, Keynesianism, that's all I do. You got to have planners. You got to use the computer. You got to calculate. And this is how we'll get full employment. The truth is that they don't know anything about getting full employment, and they have caused all this trouble. And then, of course, when the country really gets in trouble and the American people think we're really in trouble, what happens? It's open field for the demagogues to come in and say, I'll take care of this. We're going to, put on tariffs and prevent people from coming in, and we'll penalize people who come in to do work and want to send the money back to their families. It's just one problem leads to another. That to me is such a tragedy.
Yes, I mean, it saddens me when I see politicians, especially on the Democratic side, that, they, on the one hand, they complain about youth unemployment, and on the other, they're going to fix it by making it even harder for a youth to become employed. It's so backwards, and it makes you wonder, what's the motivation? Why are they so willing to just kick the poor to the sidewalk? Do they want them on unemployment? Do they think they're going to be better voters if they're on the dole? I mean, it's really sad that you're going to outlaw somebody from getting a job. The way that the free market would handle it is people could bid. They could, if there is no minimum wage, you could try to sell your labor for $10 an hour, $8 an hour. At least you would have a job. With the minimum wage, you get nothing except unemployment. And that's the sad part. And, we're a long way away from a majority of Americans, at least, believing that, because they're so hardwired to believe that you need this, but at least we're doing our part to try to speak some sense here, Dr. Paul.
Yeah, so, the one other thing that they forget about, because I like to deal with some of these problems in the sense of morality and overall, what does it mean? If you concede to the government the right to set wages at the lower end, you concede to the government the right to limit governments on the upper end. And they have this. I was very much aware of what was happening in the early 70s. And matter of fact, when I really started getting interested in economics and in politics, and because we had wage and price controls. So there was a limit on what you can do. So if you concede this principle that government is all wise and they know how to raise wages and help the poor, they also know how to suppress, wages in order to diminish the bad effects of monetary inflation. So that is always the problem that they have. They create one problem and they try to correct it and they get two more. But I would say that the main problem and why people do these things, I didn't meet many people in Congress that were malicious. They just weren't. They were bleeding hearts at time, or what else can I do? Yes, you're right on the long run, but we have this such a mess here, so we can't do it. But they've also been hit with bad education, not just in the last 10 or 15 years, I would say last 70 or 80 years, when we started to go with this interventionism where we had Keynesian economic planning, inflationism, printing money. See, they still believe that printing money is wealth, which is absolutely false. It diminishes wealth. So they claim that, if we just give the poor people more money with higher wage, it'll be okay. And this will lead to something that we may well see, that if the people won't spend money, of course they're frightened or they may not have any money, the government now, they printed a lot of money, but it hasn't gotten into the hands of the right people to spend it. So I see a time where they're going to be passing out the money and just give everybody money, the helicopter approach, and get people to spend money, and the economy is going to do fine, which will absolutely backfire on them. So that is what we have to face. Chris, I want to thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Dr. Paul. Thank you.
There's a movement in cities across the country to raise the minimum wage to $15 per hour. One of the most prominent advocates is former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, who thinks that $15 per hour should be the minimum wage for the entire country. This is a bad idea. Here are 3 reasons why. First of all, it would kill jobs. One of the basic lessons of economics is that when the price of something goes up, people buy less of it. So, if the price of pumpkin lattes rises, you can expect consumers to buy fewer of them. This law of demand also affects the market for low-skilled workers. Raising the minimum wage means a higher cost of employing each worker, which makes workers less affordable than before. Our coffee shop won't keep a worker at the mandated $15 per hour if that worker's efforts only result in $7.25 per hour in added revenue. Over the course of a year, a shop that keeps such a worker full-time would lose $15,500. So instead, it will eliminate that job. And evidence shows that employers in fact do respond in this way to minimum wage hikes. Recent research by economists Jeffrey Clemens and Michael Wither finds that 1.4 million jobs were destroyed in the late 2000s when the minimum wage rose across all 50 states by an average of nearly 30%. And worse, those job losses were probably suffered by the people who need jobs the most. This fact brings us to reason number 2. The minimum wage actually hurts the people we most want to help. When the minimum wage rises, the workers fired first and the ones hired last are those who employers judge to be the least productive. The inner-city teen from the lousy school district or the immigrant with poor English will be fired before the suburban American teen from the excellent school district. So those who are most disadvantaged tend to suffer the most job losses. This reality is compounded by the fact that raising the minimum wage causes more competition for jobs. A supermarket job that once paid $8 per hour draws more applicants when it pays $15 per hour. Applicants who include retirees and people with higher education who re-enter the workforce only because of the higher wage. Because these people often have more skills, they squeeze out immigrants and those from disadvantaged backgrounds who are likely more desperate for the jobs and certainly more desperate to gain job experience. The third reason is that minimum wage hikes aren't necessary to give deserving workers raises. 96% of American workers today earn wages higher than the current minimum wage, which proves that employers don't just pay the minimum that they're obliged to pay by law. Employers respond to the value that each employee adds so they can retain the best talent. It's expensive to train new employees, and businesses don't want to lose good workers to their competitors. So they raise worker pay voluntarily as employees gain more skills and experience. But when government imposes such raises by hiking the minimum wage, some of the least experienced workers will not only lose their current jobs, they'll find it incredibly hard to find other jobs. In essence, the minimum wage cuts off the first rung on the employment ladder, and it's that first, lowest paying rung that provides the skills and experience workers need to reach the next rung and to continue climbing their way to a better life.
Most people in this town view the state and a lot of the government programs and taxation programs as aiding minorities and especially blacks. And you're making the argument in your writings for 30, 40 years and in your book that in fact policies like the minimum wage, the expansion of the welfare state have actually been a setback for minorities. How do you defend yourself against your critics?
Well, if you look at the minimum wage, most Americans support the minimum wage and increase in the minimum wage because they have good intentions. They think that, gee, it will help low-skilled people earn higher living. But when you look at public policy, you should not look at the intentions behind public policy. You should ask the question, what are the effects? And you can see the effect of the minimum wage law if you put yourself in the place of an employer. And you say, and you have to pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire. Well then, would you hire a worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that would only enable him to produce $3 or $4 worth of value per hour? Well, most employers will look at that as a losing economic proposition. That is to pay somebody $7.25 when that somebody could only produce $4 worth of value per hour. And so the effect of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled people. And if you look at
wait a minute, those are the people who are going to get the minimum wage.
No, they're not going to get a job in the first place. That is, there's the lowest skilled people, the employer just will not hire them. Now, in the absence of a minimum wage law, if he could pay them $3 or $4 an hour, $5 an hour, well, they could be employed and they would learn something on the job. They get on-the-job training and ultimately be worth $7.25 or even more than that. So what the minimum wage law does, it cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. And if you look for the empirical evidence of this, you just look at our labor force and you see that the unemployment rate among teenagers is the highest. And teenagers are low skilled because they lack the experience and maturity and other attributes of adults. And among that group are black teenagers who not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of often going to rotten schools, getting fraudulent education, poor backgrounds, rotten neighborhoods, and early work experiences are very, very important for people who have this kind of background. Now, there's something else about the minimum wage law that nobody considers, and I point that out in a book I wrote in 1989. It's called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And in that book, I do a study of labor markets in South Africa during its apartheid era. And I give citation after citation of racist unions in South Africa who would never have a black as a member, were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated reason was to make the wage high enough so that employers would not hire black workers, they would hire white workers. So it turns out that the minimum wage is the most effective tool in the arsenal of racists everywhere in the world. And let me just give one more example on minimum wage law. The first minimum wage law in our country was the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931. And the Davis-Bacon Act says that all workers in federally funded or federally assisted construction projects must be paid the prevailing wage. And if you look on page 6513 of the Congressional Record on March 31st, 1931, you'll see congressional testimony where congressmen will say, see that contractor over there? He brings cheap colored labor up from the South, puts them in cabins, and it's labor of that sort that has to compete, that white Americans are competing against. It was all kinds of testimony in support of the Davis-Bacon Act that demonstrated that they wanted to keep blacks out of construction. Wow. And see, the tragedy of it is that the Davis-Bacon Act is still on the books today. And another part of the tragedy is that black congressmen, they also support the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, they support the Davis-Bacon Act because unions want the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, the people who support the Davis-Bacon Act today, they just don't use the same rhetoric. They use a more enlightened rhetoric in support of the Davis-Bacon Act. And so that's the same thing when you regulate any price. You handicap less preferred people.
So if Jesse Jackson were here, or some of the more liberal economists, they would respond to what you're saying by saying, well, look, maybe some people will lose their jobs. But, you know, if you look at the statistics, a disproportionate share of the people who get minimum wage are blacks and Hispanics, minorities. And Walter Williams, you are denying these people a pay raise. And then they would ask you, and I want you to respond to this, they'd say, well, Walter Williams, do you want no minimum wage? I mean, should there be no minimum wage that you could pay someone 50 cents a dollar? You're just going to drive those wages down to the least common denominator.
Well, first of all, that would be untrue, but I would answer the question, yeah, I would want no minimum wage, because what the minimum wage law does, I believe in people's right to contract and be able to engage in peaceable voluntary exchange at mutually beneficial or mutually agreeable terms. And the minimum wage law interferes with that. And matter of fact, the courts for a long time in the United States held that same position. And so I believe that people have the right to negotiate. And then also a lot of people say the minimum wage law is an anti-poverty device. It reduces poverty. Well, that doesn't even pass the smell test. I mean, because if it were an anti-poverty device, rather than our spending all these millions and billions of dollars in foreign aid, we just tell Bangladesh and Haiti, you could be rich like we are, just have a higher minimum wage. That's just utter nonsense. And then also, the empirical evidence on the minimum wage law, in 1948, the unemployment rate among black teenagers was 9.4%.
1948.
1948. The unemployment rate among white teenagers was like 10.2.
So it's lower.
It was lower.
Lower for blacks than whites.
Yeah, and the labor force participation rates for black teenagers were greater than white teenagers. Matter of fact, it was 106%. And so you say, well, how come in 1948? Was there less discrimination? Is that why? Or were blacks more in 1948 higher skilled than whites? No, it was the minimum wage law.
What's wrong? I can't find a job. I have been looking for almost a year. I'm sorry to hear that. The problem is that I don't have much education and I have no special skills. I might be able to help you. How? I own a business. I might have a job I can offer you. Really? There is a job that would help me improve my customers' experience with my business, so I can keep them even happier. It does not require any special skill. Would you be interested? Of course I'm interested. I would take anything at this point. There is only one problem. What is that? Because it's not a really important job, I can only afford to pay you $5 per hour. That's not a problem at all. It's a good start. I make $0 per hour at the moment.
What is going on here?
Nothing. I just offered him a job.
For $5 per hour?
Yes.
You cannot do that.
Why not?
You have to pay him at least $7 per hour.
And who are you?
I am the government. And I am here to make sure you are not exploiting him.
I am not exploiting anyone. I just offered him an opportunity, and he accepted. I am not forcing him to work for me.
If you want him to work for you, you have to pay him at least $7 per hour.
I cannot afford that. If I pay $7 per hour for this job, I am losing money. I am better off not hiring anyone at all.
Well, then you will not hire anyone then.
I thought you were supposed to care about people like him, that have no job. Why are you preventing him from getting a job?
I do care, but if I allow this, companies will just pay the employees whatever they want.
That is not true at all. If it were true, there would not be so many people out there, getting paid more than the minimum wage. Bobo, can you come here please?
Yes.
What do you do for a living, Bobo?
I am an engineer.
What would you do if your boss decided to pay you only $30,000 per year?
I would quit and work for someone else.
What makes you so confident that someone else will pay you more than that?
I am good at what I do, and I help my employer make more money. The more money I help the company make, the more my employer is willing to pay me.
Thanks, Bobo. See, a company cannot pay whatever it wants to pay because the employees will just go somewhere else to work.
Well, companies could get together and decide on an amount that they will offer their employees, so the employees will have nowhere to go to get paid more.
You are ignoring a very important fact.
What fact is that?
Companies compete with each other. If some companies decided to do this, some other company would come and offer the employees more money, so they can beat the other companies by hiring better people. Employees get paid based on how much value they bring to their company, and depending on this value, companies will compete to hire them by offering more money.
The point is, a person cannot support himself by making $5 per hour.
But I want the job. I do not plan to make $5 per hour forever. I see this as a stepping stone. Perhaps I can learn some skills as I work, and prove that I am a good worker, and in the future, I could move up, and get a better job within his company. Should I not have the freedom to choose how much I want to sell my services for? Do I not get a say in all of this?
No, you do not. I will help you by giving you welfare.
Let me get this straight. You don't want him to make money by providing a service that actually helps people. You would rather pay him not to work.
Correct.
And you want to pay him not to work, with money that you take from people that work.
Correct.
So you are taking money from people that provide a service to others, so that you can prevent other people from providing services to others.
It is not fair to pay someone $5 per hour.
Do you think it is better for someone to be unemployed?
No, but you must pay him more.
Like I said before, I cannot afford it. I would lose money. What you are doing isn't helping anyone. You are creating unemployment and preventing him from getting ahead. Think about what would happen if you did not allow cars to be sold for less than $5,000. We would end up with a lot of unsold cars, because people will not be willing to pay $5,000 for the cars that are not worth that much. The same thing is true for labor. You are creating unemployment by preventing labor that is worth less than the minimum wage from being sold. So we end up with a lot of people that have no jobs.
This conversation is over.
Sorry, man. I cannot hire you.
So what's a Dollarama going to do with these minimum wage hikes? If you have 5 or 10 staff in a store, I mean cashiers, people stocking the shelves, maybe the security guard catching shoplifters, maybe the shift manager. So now you're jacking up Dollarama's cost by what? Maybe $50 an hour? 10 hours a day? I'm just guessing the math here. So you might need $500 more per day just to be the same as you were before. I'm not even talking about payroll taxes and other benefits the companies have to pay. $500 a day more you have to wring out of a store. That is a lot of $1 crayon packs, a lot of $2 cans of tuna. And I'm just talking about the margin. I mean, what does Dollarama make off every $1 pack of crayons? Do they make 10 cents maybe? So how much do they have to sell to profit an extra $500 more a day? Do they have to sell $5,000 more of like crayons and party favors? $10,000 more to wring out $500 more profit just to keep Kathleen Wynne and Rachel Notley's promises. I don't know enough about Dollarama's business margins, but I do know this. Dollarama knows this will kill them. So look at this. Take a look. Dollarama is getting rid of staff. They're getting self-checkout stations. And that's the thing. Minimum wage hikes are great if you can hold on to your job. You get $15 an hour for doing the same thing you're getting $12 an hour for now. If you keep your job, if you keep getting as many hours a week. So it can work if you're lucky, or I guess you could get $0 an hour if you're fired or laid off. But what should the ordinary franchisee do? Well, if they're forced to give staff a 21% raise, they're going to take it back from other free perks they're giving out. They just have to survive. For example, they're making staff pay for their own uniforms. They're not paying for lunch breaks anymore. Does that sound mean? I guess it does. But what if you were suddenly ordered to pay someone 21% more for the job than you could afford to? Do you really think the poor schleps who buy a Tim Hortons franchise and work 18 hours a day, do you really think they're rich tycoons? Do you think they're fat cats? I can't think of a harder job than running a coffee shop. I mean, of course, there's always the alternative, just bring in the giant iPads, right? What did you think would happen? Did you think there was 21% fat in a Tim Hortons business? Or 1,000 other businesses that hire low-skill, entry-level folks? Well, Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, she raged at these franchisees. In particular, she named Ron Joyce Jr., who runs a couple of Tim Hortons franchises. Now, his dad started Tim Hortons back in the day, but Jr. still runs a couple of franchises, which is funny. I mean, if he were just about the money, you'd think he would have retired in the Caribbean by now. I mean, I think the guy actually loves running coffee shops, don't you think? And he would know that you have to pay the bills. Unlike Kathleen Wynne, who, you know, you run a Tim Hortons, you just can't run $1 billion deficit in a coffee shop. It all has to add up every month.
The province of Ontario announced that over the next year and a half, minimum wage will go up to $15. As an employee, you might be thinking, this is a big win. But for companies like Metro, Magna, and even Loblaws, they're sounding the alarm bell, saying higher wages come with a number of negative impacts. Here to break down what this means for both Canadians and our economy is Derek Burleton from TD Economics. Thanks very much for being here, Derek.
Hi there.
So I mentioned, I started off with Ontario, but this is something Alberta and BC have also talked about. So how does the Ontario proposal compare to other provinces and even the U.S.?
Well, it is. It isn't new. We've seen other provinces and U.S. jurisdictions move. 15 seems to be the number these days, and Canada really is the bigger provinces taking the lead. Alberta is partway through a plan to raise its wage to $15. BC has a plan. The new government there wants to get it to 15, but hasn't announced a timetable for that. So Ontario is part of this new wave moving to $15. Most other provinces, the smaller ones, tend to have lower wages, partly reflecting a lower cost of living in those cities between sort of $9 and $11.
Now, one of the things that I thought was really interesting in your report is when people think about minimum wage, they often think these are younger people or students. But when you looked at the demographics, it painted a bit of a different picture. What can you tell us about that mix?
Well, teens do make up a significant share, but 40% of minimum wage earners are teens. And then when you kind of go up through the age spectrum from there, the rest of it is largely young adults, so that makes up a big difference. So definitely skewed to the younger end of the population. But under this new plan, what's interesting is that it would shift that balance. As you get the wage up, you would get more into the adult population, those 25 and older, and you would see a significant swing in the share to as much as 60% would be adults, as I say, 25 and older. So teens, yes, they will still make up an important part, but the pendulum would swing towards the adult population.
And with the lion's share, let's say 60% being adults, you know, if you think about how that impacts household incomes, you say that's a good thing, people are earning more. A negative impact could be businesses have to pay more in compensation. Something else that could be a knock-on effect for consumers, prices could go up. But what are some of the other hot topics or issues being debated right now?
Well, it is. You mentioned, talk about cross currents for an economist. This is both ecstasy, if I can use that word. You're sort of fighting through all these pros and cons and good things for the economy and obviously some of the concerns. Some of the things that we would also look at would be, you know, when you talk about raising the minimum wage to 15 in Ontario, you're not just looking at those that currently make 15 and less, but those that are around that precipice, sort of 15 to 17. So even in industries where you don't have a significant share right at minimum wage or below that 15, it would be of concern to some other sectors where they have a large preponderance of workers close to 15, because they would probably push for higher wages. So that's one thing. I think for us, the bigger question is not so much the level of the wage it's the speed of increase. It's the timing in the economic cycle. If you're an economy that's growing at 4%, you're going gangbusters. The economy can weather the impact, or the businesses can weather the impact of the higher costs without too much visible effect. But if it's a slow-moving economy where there's pressure on the labor markets, that would be more difficult. Certainly the magnitude is important. We tend to think about minimum wages not in isolation, but relative to the median wage in an economy. And this is important because in Alberta, they're going to 15, but the median wage in Alberta is much higher than Ontario. So that economy, it would be less of a challenge for businesses because it's all relative to what the market wages is. Whereas in Ontario, you would push up the minimum wage to about 60% of the median wage, which is relatively high in both the North American and even in an international context.
Something you touched on early on in your response there was around where we are in the economy. And with the Bank of Canada being on in a tightening cycle right now, so we're seeing a hike in rates, how do you think this could impact potentially housing and even jobs? And then you add in the layer of higher wages. Do you think it could slow our economy?
You know, there's no doubt that I do think because of those factors I just spoke of, the timing of it, the speed of it, and also other costs businesses are currently encountering, that it will have a headwind on employment. I don't think it's enough to push employment into negative territory in Ontario in the year ahead, but certainly trim the rate of employment growth down from, say, 1%, which has been the trend rate, down closer to 0.5%. So a significant impact, but not disastrous impact. But that still will have an impact on spending and on housing, and if anything, lead to somewhat weaker economic growth in 2018 and 2019 than under a business as usual basis. So this is something the Bank of Canada will have to look at. Yes, it can push up inflation in Ontario maybe by 0.3 of a point, but I think the bigger impact on monetary policy will be somewhat of the weakening effect that we see on a longer term basis, not the short term higher spending from a wage increase, but that would probably lead the Bank of Canada to slow the pace of interest rate increases relative to what it would have been otherwise. So we're comfortable with our view on the bank proceeding very gradually with higher rates. But because of this policy, we're not increasing the rate story, but more, if anything, just being a bit cautious in terms of where we see policy and rates going.
So a factor to consider, but not necessarily a big proponent.
Yeah, I mean, Ontario is 40% of Canada, but the impacts we're looking at both in terms of employment, spending, and on inflation, you know, they will show up to some extent, certainly in our projections. But I think when the Bank of Canada is looking across an array of effects, if anything, it's just going to lead to more caution on the rate increases.
A very hot topic as part of this debate has been the number of potential job losses as a result of higher wages. If you had to estimate, you know, what that could look like or how many jobs, how would you, or what do you think that could look like?
Well, you know, I think again, you know, I do think I'm comfortable with the view that it's going to slow the rate of hiring demand. It's quite a significant cost increase, and so businesses will have to look at ways to make up the difference, whether it's automation or trimming back hours, or even laying off some workers at the minimum wage level. So, you know, I think if anything, our view is probably 80 to 90,000 will be the impact over 3 years by the end of the decade in terms of lower employment relative to business as usual. That gets you to just a more modest rate of employment growth on a net basis. So, you know, we're already looking at a slowdown in Ontario employment growth, but if anything, this will just push it a little bit lower.
Now, an important distinction being not negative employment, but just a slower pace of growth.
Yeah, I think so, and that's something, I mean, the media, when they saw the report, tended to read it as TD Economics calling for an outright decline in employment, but that's not what we're saying. I think, you know, again, I think this gets an important point. There are ways to mitigate those effects, and that's something we also mentioned in the report. They could stretch out the timeline by 2 years. And I think any chance you give businesses another year or two to adjust, I think that, if anything, would preserve some of the positive effects, because I think you have to acknowledge that it will help some low-income individuals. You talk about living wage, it'll help those individuals, but you want to mitigate some of the negative consequences, and I think that would be a good balance in this case.
And just to close off, you brought up living wage. Just an important distinction being minimum wage versus living wage, where that's the cost it would take someone to live in a specific city. And this has been debated amongst politicians and economists in terms of which one would have a bigger impact or which one is more relevant. But in addressing poverty, you say it's actually about more than that. How so?
Well, it is. I mean, you look at the minimum wage, you're going to help some residents in low income, there's no doubt. So I'm not saying it's completely ineffective, but it's not the sharpest tool in the drawer to deal with poverty. I like programs more embedded within the income tax system that the governments run. There are already some great plans. The working income tax benefit in Canada is a good model for how you support individuals as they move from welfare to work, and even, you know, at the lower end of the income spectrum. So the problem is, of course, these cost money, and that's a challenge right now. But they are better to deal with poverty than is the minimum wage. So, you know, and I think you mentioned a good point there. I think you talk about a living wage, but you look across Ontario and the level of market wages vary so much from Windsor to Toronto. Toronto's a high wage. So I think the government needs to think a bit about maybe having varying minimum wages depending on the region within a province. In the US, they have a model for that. Cities have their own minimum wage. Seattle has moved to $15, you know. So I think there should be some thought as to, can we come up with a plan? This would be, I don't think this has been seen anywhere in Canada, but just given the different costs of living, you could have, you know, a $12 minimum wage in Windsor versus a $15 in Toronto. I think that would be more appropriate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.